The morning of my wedding, I woke up with the kind of peace you only get when everything in your life has finally fallen into place. Sunlight streamed through the French doors of the bridal suite at Chateau Marmont, casting golden rectangles across the silk of my Veroline gown. In 12 hours, I would be Mrs. Victoria Chen Montgomery, wife of tech entrepreneur Marcus Montgomery, stepdaughter-in-law to oil heiress Patricia Montgomery, and finally worthy of the world I'd been orbiting my entire life. My mother, Isabella Chen, had built enchanted events from nothing. Starting with church weddings in Chinatown 30 years ago, she'd clawed her way into Beverly Hills society, one perfect ceremony at a time. By the time I was 15, she was orchestrating weddings for Hollywood royalty, tech billionaires, and old money families who measured their worth in generations, not dollars. I grew up in the shadows of these celebrations, watching from behind catering tables as women in couture gowns glided across marble floors, their diamonds catching the light from crystal chandeliers. I learned early that in this world, you were either the star or the help. There was no middle ground. Victoria, darling. My mother's voice drifted from the adjoining room, where she was directing the final touches for today's ceremony. Even on my wedding day, she couldn't resist the pull of perfection. The florist is here with the last of the peonies. I need you to approve the altar arrangements. I smiled, slipping on my silk robe. This was classic mom, micromanaging every detail until the very last second. She'd been planning my wedding for 8 months, ever since Marcus proposed on a yacht in Monaco. Surrounded by his family and their circle of impossibly beautiful, impossibly wealthy friends. The proposal itself had been straight out of a fairy tale. Marcus had flown me to Monaco for what I thought was just a romantic weekend. Instead, I found myself on a 200-foot yacht with 30 of the most influential people on the West Coast, watching as he dropped to one knee with a 5-carat Tiffany diamond while a string quartet played our song. Victoria Chen, he'd said, his voice carrying across the deck as everyone held their breath. You've changed my life. You've made me want to be the man my father always said I could be. Will you marry me? The ring was exquisite, the setting was perfect, the timing was flawless. I said yes, of course, and the crowd erupted in applause while champagne appeared as if by magic. Patricia Montgomery, Marcus's stepmother, had been the first to embrace me, her smile warm and welcoming. Welcome to the family, darling, she'd whispered in my ear, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The past 8 months had been a whirlwind of dress fittings, venue tours, and endless meetings with vendors. My mother had insisted on handling everything, and I'd been grateful. Enchanted Events was renowned for creating weddings that looked effortless, but cost more than most people's houses. Every detail would be perfect because Isabella Chen's reputation depended on it. Especially when the bride was her own daughter. The flowers are perfect, Mom. I called back. Not bothering to look, I trusted her implicitly. In 28 years, I'd never seen her make a mistake that mattered. I walked to the window overlooking the garden, where our ceremony would take place in a few hours. The morning fog was already burning off, revealing the manicured perfection my mother had orchestrated. White roses and peonies lined the aisle, with fairy lights woven through the branches of ancient oak trees. At the altar, beneath an arch of white hydrangeas, Marcus and I would promise to love each other forever. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Marcus. Can't wait to see you walk down that aisle, beautiful. Today's the beginning of everything. I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. The same one I'd felt when he first asked me out 18 months ago. We'd met at a charity gala my mother was coordinating. He'd been there with his family. Looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, but what had caught my attention wasn't his looks or his obvious wealth. It was the way he'd spoken to the catering staff. Remembering their names, asking about their families. In a room full of people who treated service workers like furniture, his kindness had stood out. Later, he'd found me in the kitchen, making sure the final course went out perfectly. You're Isabella's daughter, he'd said, not a question but a statement. I've been wanting to meet you all night. Oh, I'd replied, suddenly aware that I was still wearing my headset, and probably had frosting on my dress from directing the cake service. I'm just helping out, nothing glamorous. I think what you do is incredible, he'd said, and his sincerity had made my cheeks burn. You make magic happen behind the scenes. That's the hardest job in the room. He'd asked for my number that night, and we'd had our first date 3 days later. Coffee at a small cafe in Santa Monica, where he'd listened intently as I told him about my dreams of expanding my mother's business, maybe branching into corporate events or destination weddings. He'd talked about his tech company, how he was developing sustainable energy solutions, how he wanted to make a real difference in the world. We were both children of successful parents, both carrying the weight of expectations, both trying to forge our own paths, while honoring our family legacies. It had felt like finding a kindred spirit. The relationship had progressed naturally. Family dinners where Patricia had treated me like the daughter she'd never had. Weekend trips to their house in Napa, where Marcus and I would walk through the vineyards talking about our future. Quiet evenings in his Malibu apartment, cooking dinner together and planning the life we wanted to build. He'd integrated seamlessly into my world too. He'd charmed my mother, which wasn't easy, and had genuinely seemed interested in the wedding industry. He'd even suggested improvements for some of our vendor management systems, little tech solutions that had streamlined our operations considerably. Looking back, I should have noticed when things started to change. It was subtle at first. The way his attention would drift when I talked about work. The way he'd check his phone constantly during our dinners. The way he'd started suggesting I might want to take a step back from the business once we were married. You won't need to work so hard anymore, he'd said just last month, his hand covering mine across the dinner table at Nobu. My mom never worked after she married Dad. She focused on charity work, social events, being the perfect hostess. That's what wives do in our circle. I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just being protective. Now, getting ready for our wedding, I pushed down a nagging worry that had been growing stronger each day. Marcus had been distant lately, stressed about some business deal he wouldn't discuss. His texts were shorter, his phone calls less frequent. When I'd asked about it, he'd said it was just pre-wedding nerves. That all grooms went through this. Every couple has doubts. Patricia had reassured me when I'd mentioned it to her over lunch last week. Marcus is just overwhelmed with work. You know how men are about multitasking. Once the wedding is over, he'll be back to his normal self. I'd wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Because if Marcus was having second thoughts, if he was planning to call off the wedding, it would destroy more than just my heart. It would humiliate my mother in front of every important client she'd ever had. The guest list read like a who's who of Los Angeles society. Entertainment executives, real estate moguls, tech billionaires, old money families whose names were on hospital wings and university buildings. These were people who could make or break careers, with a whispered conversation at the country club. My mother appeared in the doorway, impeccable as always in her navy Armani suit. At 58, Isabella Chen looked a decade younger, her success having afforded her the best of everything: personal trainers, nutritionists, dermatologists, stylists. She was living proof that money could indeed buy a certain kind of perfection. The photographer wants to start with some getting ready shots, she said, her practiced eyes scanning the room for any imperfection. Hair and makeup will be here in an hour. The bridesmaids are arriving at noon. Mom, I said, turning from the window. Thank you for all of this. I know how important today is for the business too. Her expression softened, just for a moment, and I saw a flash of the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through business school, who'd started her company with a $500 loan and a dream. Victoria, she said quietly. Today is about you finding happiness. Everything else is just window dressing. But even as she said it, I could see her mentally cataloging details, making sure every element would photograph perfectly for the society pages, and the Instagram posts that would follow. This wedding wasn't just about Marcus and me. It was a showcase for Enchanted Events, a demonstration of what Isabella Chen could create when money was no object. The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Hair and makeup artists transformed me into a version of myself that belonged in a bridal magazine. The photographer captured every moment. From the champagne toast with my bridesmaids to the tender moment, when my mother fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. My bridesmaids' college friends who'd grown up to become lawyers, doctors, and executives, filled the room with laughter and gentle teasing. Sarah, my maid of honor, had flown in from New York where she was making a name for herself as a corporate attorney. Emma had driven up from San Diego, where she ran her own marketing firm. These were smart, successful women who'd known me since I was 19 and idealistic, dreaming of taking over my mother's business and making it even bigger. "You look absolutely radiant," Sarah said as we posed for photos. "Marcus is going to lose his mind when he sees you." I smiled, but something in her tone made me look at her more closely. Sarah had always been the most direct of my friends, never one to sugarcoat difficult truths. "Sarah," I said, catching her arm as the photographer moved to adjust the lighting. "Is everything okay? You seem, I don't know, worried." She hesitated, glancing around at the other bridesmaids who were chatting and sipping champagne. "Victoria, I probably shouldn't say anything, but..." My heart stopped. "What?" "I ran into Jessica Morrison last week at that new restaurant in Beverly Hills. You remember Jessica from college? She's working at some tech startup now." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She mentioned that Marcus was there, having dinner with someone. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. Someone? Young, blonde. Looked like a model. They seemed close. I forced myself to breathe. It was probably just business. Marcus has meetings all the time. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. I'd been ignoring the signs for weeks. The late nights, the cancelled dates. The way he'd started treating me like an obligation rather than the love of his life. "I'm sure you're right," Sarah said quickly, but her eyes were full of concern. "I just thought, if it were me, I'd want to know." Before I could respond, my mother swept back into the room. "Ladies, it's time. The guests are seated, the string quartet is in position, and the groom." She paused, a slight frown crossing her face. "The groom's party is ready." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "Mom, is Marcus okay?" "Of course, darling. Just some last-minute technical difficulties with the sound system. Nothing we can't handle." But I could see it now, the tension around her eyes. The way she was gripping her phone a little too tightly. My mother had orchestrated hundreds of weddings. She never looked nervous unless something was seriously wrong. The walk from the bridal suite to the garden felt like a death march. My bridesmaids preceded me, their soft pink gowns floating across the perfectly manicured lawn as the string quartet played Pachelbel's canon. Through the French doors, I could see our guests, 300 of the most influential people in Los Angeles, seated in perfect rows of white chairs, their faces turned expectantly toward the altar. My father, who'd flown in from Hong Kong where he now lived with his second family, appeared at my side. Despite their divorce when I was 12, my parents had maintained a cordial relationship, united in their love for me and their shared pride in what my mother had built. "You look beautiful, Victoria," he said, offering me his arm. "Are you ready?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Through the window I could see the altar where Marcus should be waiting. The officiant was there, looking distinguished in his black robes. The groomsmen stood in a neat line, handsome in their matching tuxedos. But where Marcus should have been standing, there was empty space. My mother appeared at my shoulder, her face a mask of professional calm that didn't quite hide the panic in her eyes. "There's been a slight delay," she said quietly. "Marcus is handling some urgent business. He'll be here any moment." But I could see the truth in her expression. I could see it in the way the groomsmen were shifting uncomfortably, checking their phones, avoiding eye contact with our guests. I could see it in the whispered conversation starting to ripple through the crowd. Marcus wasn't coming. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I gripped my father's arm, fighting the urge to collapse right there, on the marble threshold between my old life and whatever came next. "Victoria," my mother whispered urgently, "we need to make a decision. The guests are waiting." I looked out at those 300 faces. Entertainment executives who could make or break careers. Business leaders who controlled billions in investments. Society matrons whose approval could elevate a company to legendary status, or destroy it with a whispered campaign of social assassination. My mother's entire reputation was on display in that garden. Every flower, every light, every perfectly pressed napkin, was a testament to her skill and vision. Enchanted events had created magic, just as we always did. But there was no groom. My phone buzzed in my bouquet. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. A text message from Marcus. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I can't do this. I'm not ready for marriage. I'm not ready for the life everyone expects me to live. I need to find myself." Figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what everyone else wants. I'm flying to Europe tonight. Please don't try to contact me. I hope someday you can forgive me. That was it. 22 words to end an 18-month relationship. 22 words to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered in our world. 22 words to potentially destroy everything my mother had spent 30 years building. I stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, as if the words might change if I looked at them enough times. Behind me, I could hear my father and mother having an urgent, whispered conversation. In the garden, the string quartet continued playing, but I could see confusion spreading through the crowd like ripples in still water. What do you want to do? My father asked gently. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I handed my phone to my mother. She read the message, her face cycling through shock, rage, and then a cold fury I'd never seen before. That coward, she whispered. That absolute coward. I looked out at our guests again. These people had cleared their Saturday afternoon. Had worn their best clothes, had brought expensive gifts. They were here to celebrate what they thought was the love story of the decade. The successful entrepreneur and the wedding planner's daughter, joining two worlds in perfect harmony. Instead, they were about to witness my complete humiliation. Unless... Mom, I said quietly, I need you to go to the altar. I need you to tell them that there's been an emergency. Tell them that Marcus had a family crisis and had to leave immediately. Tell them the wedding is postponed, not cancelled. Postponed, Victoria. Please. Just do this for me, I'll handle the rest. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then nodded. She walked out into the garden, her spine straight, her head high. I watched through the window as she approached the microphone at the altar, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have an unexpected situation. The Montgomery family has had a medical emergency that required Marcus's immediate attention. As you can imagine, this is devastating for everyone involved, but family comes first. The wedding is being postponed until further notice. We appreciate your understanding and your presence here today. The crowd began to murmur. But my mother continued with the grace and authority that had made her the most sought after wedding planner in California. If you'd like to join us for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres in the main dining room, we'd be honored to have your company. This beautiful day shouldn't go to waste entirely. I watched as our guests began to move toward the house, their conversations animated with speculation and concern. Some looked genuinely worried. Others looked like they smelled scandal and were eager to be part of the story. I stood in the doorway, still in my wedding dress, still holding my bouquet of white peonies, and felt something inside me crystallize into a diamond, hard resolve. Marcus Montgomery thought he could humiliate me. He thought he could destroy my mother's reputation with his cowardice. He thought he could walk away from this without consequences, probably assuming that his family's money and influence would protect him from any real fallout. He was wrong. I walked back to the bridal suite, and sat down at the antique writing desk my mother had chosen for the room. I opened my laptop and began typing. The first email was to my mother's assistant, asking her to send me the complete guest list from today's wedding, along with their contact information and social media handles. The second email was to Sarah, asking her to use her legal connections to find out everything she could about Marcus's recent business dealings and personal activities. The third email was to my college roommate, who now worked as an investigative journalist for a major lifestyle magazine. I asked her to look into the Montgomery family's business empire, particularly any recent deals or ventures that might be vulnerable to negative publicity. I wasn't going to chase after Marcus, begging him to come back. I wasn't going to cry or plead or make a scene. I was going to do something much more effective. I was going to make sure that Marcus Montgomery's name became synonymous with betrayal and cowardice in every circle that mattered to him. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. And that meant going through the papers my mother had shown me just once, 6 months ago, when she'd been updating her will. Papers that Marcus had never seen. Papers that proved I wasn't just the wedding planner's daughter, I was the wedding planner's heir. My mother had started Enchanted Events with a $500 loan, but over 30 years, she'd built it into something much bigger than just a wedding planning company. We owned real estate in Beverly Hills, Napa, and Malibu. We had exclusive contracts with the most sought-after vendors in the industry. We had a client list that read like a Forbes 500 directory. More importantly, we had influence. Real, tangible influence over the people who shaped trends, made deals, and decided which names got whispered with admiration, and which got whispered with disgust. Marcus thought he was walking away from a heartbroken girl, who would fade into the background of his privileged life. He had no idea he just declared war on a business empire that specialized in making dreams come true. And occasionally, in making nightmares come to life. I spent the next hour at that desk, making lists and sending emails. By the time my mother knocked on the door, I had the beginning of a plan. "How are you holding up, darling?" she asked, still wearing her navy suit, though her perfect composure was starting to show cracks around the edges. "I'm fine," I said, and for the first time since reading Marcus's text, I meant it. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm focused." She raised an eyebrow, recognizing something in my tone that she'd probably inherited from her own mother, who'd survived the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong and built a new life in America with nothing but determination and steel will. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need you to tell me about the Montgomery contract." My mother's expression sharpened. 6 months ago, she'd mentioned in passing that she'd signed an exclusive agreement to handle all Montgomery family events for the next 5 years. Weddings, anniversaries, corporate functions, charity galas. It was potentially the most lucrative contract in Enchanted Events history. "What about it? I need to see the cancellation clauses, particularly the ones related to breach of contract by the client." My mother smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it reached her eyes. "I'll get the file." While she was gone, I changed out of my wedding dress and into a simple black sheath dress. I took off the elaborate updo, and let my hair fall loose around my shoulders. I removed the dramatic makeup, and replaced it with something subtle and professional. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a jilted bride. I saw Isabella Chen's daughter, raised in the family business, educated at Wharton, fluent in the language of contracts and consequences. My mother returned with a thick folder and set it on the desk between us. The Montgomery contract specifies that any cancellation of a major event with less than 48 hours notice results in forfeiture of all deposits and payment of full damages, she said. That includes not just our fee, but compensation for vendor cancellations, lost business opportunities, and reputation damage. I flipped through the contract, reading the fine print that Marcus had signed without a second thought, probably assuming that his family's money made them immune to consequences. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "For today's wedding alone, $750,000. That's before we factor in the reputational damage clause." I felt my first smile of the day. "And the 5-year exclusivity agreement. $2.4 million in projected revenue. So if we invoke the cancellation and reputational damage clauses, Marcus Montgomery personally owes Enchanted Events $3.2 million. I closed the contract and looked at my mother. "File the lawsuit first thing Monday morning. Make sure the papers are served at his office, not his home. Maximum publicity. Victoria, are you sure? The Montgomery family has resources. They'll fight this. Let them fight. But while they're fighting, they'll also be explaining to everyone they know why their golden boy ran away from his own wedding. They'll be answering questions about what kind of man abandons his bride via text message." I stood up and walked to the window. Down in the garden, the catering staff was cleaning up the remains of what should have been the happiest day of my life. But I wasn't sad anymore. I was calculating. "There's something else," I said. "I want you to put out some very discreet inquiries. Find out which events Marcus is scheduled to attend in the next few months. Charity galas, business conferences, social functions. Especially the ones where he's supposed to be honored or recognized. What are you planning?" I turned back to face her. And she must have seen something in my expression that reminded her of herself at my age, hungry and determined, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. "I'm planning to make sure that Marcus Montgomery becomes a cautionary tale. I'm planning to make sure that every woman in our social circle knows exactly what kind of man he is. And I'm planning to make sure that his family's reputation becomes so toxic that no one will want to do business with them." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to be brilliant. Just like you always are. The next 3 weeks were the most focused I'd ever been in my life. While Marcus was presumably finding himself somewhere in Europe, I was systematically dismantling his reputation from 5,000 miles away. The first domino fell when the lawsuit hit the news. Tech entrepreneur Marcus Montgomery sued for $3.2 million after abandoning bride at altar. The story ran in the business section of the Los Angeles Times, but it quickly spread to the lifestyle blogs and entertainment websites. The second domino fell when Sarah's legal contacts revealed that Marcus's startup was in serious financial trouble. They'd been courting investors for months, trying to raise a second round of funding to keep the company afloat. Suddenly, those investors were having second thoughts about backing a man who couldn't honor his most basic commitments. The third domino fell when my journalist friend published a feature story about the psychology of men who abandon their partners at major life events. She didn't mention Marcus by name. But she didn't need to. Everyone who mattered already knew who she was writing about. But the real damage came from something much more subtle than negative press coverage. It came from the whisper campaign that spread through every country club, charity board, and private dining room in Los Angeles. My mother's client list was a who's who of influential women, wives of studio heads, daughters of real estate empires, socialites who controlled access to the most exclusive events in the city. These women had been planning to attend my wedding, and they were personally offended by Marcus's behavior. More importantly, they had daughters, nieces, and friends who were exactly the kind of women Marcus would want to date now that he was single again. Within 2 weeks of my wedding, Marcus Montgomery had become persona non grata in the circles that mattered most to him. Invitations were quietly rescinded. Business meetings were mysteriously cancelled. The kind of social connections that had opened doors for him, his entire life suddenly evaporated. His stepmother Patricia called me 3 weeks after he'd fled to Europe. "Victoria," she said, her voice tight with strain, "we need to talk." We met at the Beverly Hills Hotel. In the Polo Lounge where Patricia had hosted countless power lunches over the years. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, stress lines visible around her eyes despite her expertly applied makeup. "You're destroying him," she said without preamble. "I'm not doing anything," I replied, sipping my green tea. "I'm simply letting the consequences of his actions play out naturally. The lawsuit, the media attention, the social exclusion. This isn't natural. This is orchestrated." I set down my teacup and looked at her directly. "Patricia, your stepson sent me a text message 20 minutes before our wedding ceremony was supposed to begin. He humiliated me in front of 300 people, destroyed months of planning, and cost my mother's business hundreds of thousands of dollars. What exactly did you think was going to happen? He's young, he made a mistake. Surely there's a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy his entire future." "There is," I said. "He can come home, take responsibility for his actions, and face the consequences like an adult. He can publicly apologize for his behavior and honor the contract he signed with my mother's company." Patricia's face hardened. "The Montgomery family doesn't apologize. We certainly don't pay extortion. It's not extortion. It's a legally binding contract that your stepson breached. But you're right about one thing, this isn't really about the money anymore." I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "This is about making sure that every woman in our social circle knows exactly what kind of man Marcus is. This is about ensuring that he can't do to someone else what he did to me. This is about consequences." Patricia stood up abruptly. "You underestimate the Montgomery family's resources, Victoria. We have connections you can't imagine. Influence that goes far beyond your mother's little wedding planning business." I smiled, the same calm smile my mother wore when closing a difficult deal. "Patricia, my mother has been making the impossible happen for the most powerful people in this city for 30 years. We know where all the bodies are buried. We know which marriages are shams, which fortunes are built on fraud, which reputations are hanging by a thread. You want to go to war with us? Bring it on." She left without another word. But I could see from the set of her shoulders that she understood exactly what I was threatening. The Montgomery family's wealth was built on oil investments and real estate development. But their social standing depended on the approval of the same women who formed the backbone of my mother's client base. If those women decided that the Montgomery name was toxic, Patricia's charitable work, Marcus's business prospects, and the family's entire social empire would crumble. 2 days later, Marcus called me from London. "Victoria," he said, and his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," I replied. "You said everything you needed to say in your text message." "That's not." I was panicking. "I made a huge mistake. I know that now." "Yes, you did. And now you're living with the consequences. Victoria, please, I love you, I want to come home. I want to fix this." I was quiet for a long moment, letting him hear the silence where my forgiveness should have been. "Marcus," I said finally. "Do you remember what you told me on our third date? About the importance of following through on your commitments?" "Victoria, you said that a man's word was the only thing that really mattered. That everything else, money, success, social standing, was meaningless if people couldn't trust you to keep your promises." "I remember." "Good. Because that's exactly the lesson you're learning now." I hung up. He called back immediately. I let it go to voicemail. He called 17 more times over the next 2 hours. I blocked his number. The final domino fell a month later, when Marcus's startup officially folded. The investors had pulled out, citing concerns about leadership stability and character. His business partners had quietly distanced themselves from him. The company that was supposed to make him a major player in the tech world became just another cautionary tale about venture capital gone wrong. I was in my mother's office, reviewing contracts for upcoming events, when my assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Marcus stood in our reception area, looking nothing like the confident entrepreneur who'd proposed to me on that yacht in Monaco. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, as if he'd been sleeping in them. His face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Victoria," he said when he saw me. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't agree to see you. I was just curious about what desperation looks like." He flinched. "I deserve that." "You deserve much worse than that." I led him to one of our smaller conference rooms, the one we used for difficult conversations with vendors or demanding clients. The walls were decorated with photos from some of our most successful events, a reminder of what happened when people trusted enchanted events to make their dreams come true. Marcus sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I want to make this right," he said. "There's no making this right, Marcus. There's only moving forward. I'll pay the settlement, all of it. I'll publicly apologize. I'll do whatever you want." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the man I'd thought I loved. But all I saw was someone who'd been caught, and was now trying to negotiate his way out of the consequences. "Why?" I asked. "Because I love you. Because I made the biggest mistake of my life when I ran away." "No, Marcus. Why now? Why are you here today? Offering to do things you could have done months ago?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether to tell the truth or try another lie. "Because my trust fund is frozen," he said finally. "Because every business contact I have won't return my calls. Because Patricia says the family won't support me until this is resolved." "So you're not here because you love me. You're here because you need me to call off the dogs." "Both can be true." I laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. "Marcus, do you have any idea what the last 4 months have been like for me? Do you have any concept of what it felt like to stand in that bridal suite, in my wedding dress, reading your text message? Victoria, I don't want to hear your explanation. I don't want your apology. I don't want your money. Though my mother will take every penny you owe her." I stood up, smoothing down my skirt, feeling completely in control for the first time since this whole nightmare began. "What I want is for you to understand that actions have consequences. What I want is for you to live with the knowledge that you destroyed something beautiful, because you were too much of a coward to be honest." I walked to the door, then turned back to face him. "The settlement offer expires at 5 o'clock today. After that, we'll see you in court. And I promise you that will be much more expensive, and much more public than anything that's happened so far." I left him sitting in that conference room, surrounded by photos of happy couples celebrating the most important day of their lives, and I felt nothing but relief. By 4:30 that afternoon, Marcus's attorney had wired the full settlement amount to my mother's business account. By 5 o'clock, I was sitting in my car outside the office, looking at a check for $200,000, my portion of the settlement, representing the personal damages Marcus had caused me. By 6 o'clock, I had deposited that check, and was having dinner with my mother at our favorite restaurant, celebrating not the money, but the fact that we had survived something that could have destroyed both of our reputations. "What will you do now?" my mother asked over champagne. "I'm going to take that European buying trip we talked about last year," I said. "I'm going to source some new vendors, maybe develop some destination wedding packages. I'm going to turn this entire experience into something that makes our business stronger." And personally, I thought about that for a moment. 6 months ago, I'd thought my happiness depended on becoming Mrs. Victoria Montgomery. I'd thought I needed Marcus's world to validate my worth. Now I knew better. Personally, I said, "I'm going to remember that I am Isabella Chen's daughter. I'm going to remember that I come from a line of women who build empires from nothing, who survive whatever life throws at them, and who never, ever let anyone else define their worth." My mother raised her glass. "To strong women. To strong women," I agreed. 2 years later, Enchanted Events had expanded into destination weddings and luxury corporate retreats. We had offices in New York, London, and Tokyo. My mother had been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine, and I'd been named one of Forbes' 30 under 30. In the events industry, I never saw Marcus again. Though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd eventually moved to Austin and started a small consulting firm. He'd married a local news anchor in a quiet ceremony at City Hall, no elaborate celebration, no society photographer, no feature in the lifestyle magazines. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about what might have been if he'd had the courage to follow through on his promises. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. Because I'd learned something important in those months. After he abandoned me, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's success. It's building something so beautiful and strong that the person who tried to break you becomes irrelevant to your story. I was sitting in our new London office, reviewing contracts for a royal wedding we'd been commissioned to coordinate, when my assistant buzzed in. "Mems Chen, there's a call for you. A gentleman who says he's a friend of your mother's." I picked up the phone, expecting another vendor or potential client. "Victoria. This is David Harrison. I'm calling from New York." David Harrison, investment banker, widower, father of 2 college-aged daughters. My mother had planned his late wife's memorial service 3 years ago, and he'd stayed in touch, occasionally referring clients to us. "Mr. Harrison," I said. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, I was hoping to ask you to dinner. I'm going to be in London next week for business, and I thought maybe we could spend some time together. Get to know each other better." I was quiet for a moment, surprised by the invitation. David was attractive, successful, and kind, everything Marcus had pretended to be. But more importantly, he was a man who understood loss, who'd proven his ability to commit to something beyond himself. "I'd like that," I said. "Wonderful, I'll have my assistant coordinate with yours." After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and looked out at the London skyline. Somewhere out there were millions of people living their lives, making choices, facing consequences, building futures. I thought about the girl I'd been 2 years ago, standing in a wedding dress that cost more than most people's cars, waiting for a man who would never come. She'd been so afraid of disappointing other people, so desperate for approval, so convinced that her worth depended on someone else's validation. I barely recognized her now. The intercom buzzed again. My assistant's voice. "Ms. Chen, your mother's online too, Victoria," my mother said when I picked up. "How's London?" "Busy. Profitable." "Perfect. I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've built professionally, but for who you've become. I had a good teacher. You had good instincts. You just needed to learn to trust them." After we hung up, I went back to reviewing contracts, but I found myself smiling. Not because of David's invitation, though that was nice. Not because of our business success, though that was gratifying. I was smiling because I finally understood what my mother had been trying to teach me all along. That the only approval that matters is your own. That the only validation worth having comes from knowing you've acted with integrity, courage, and intelligence. That the best weddings aren't about the dress or the flowers or the guest list. They're about 2 people who choose each other every day, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. Marcus had taught me that lesson in the cruelest way possible, but it was still a lesson worth learning. And someday, when I was ready, I would use it to build something real. Something that would last. Something beautiful. Did you like this story of resilience and quiet triumph? Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. If you enjoyed Victoria's journey from heartbreak to empire building, please support us with a super thanks, so we can continue bringing you more incredible life stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support. We look forward to your comments about Victoria's inspiring transformation. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that we highly recommend. There's so much more content on our channel, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.